90-second TV break. Then I get mad about autism.
Another day with my magic diary. It's where I keep all my secrets, because only I know the magic code to open it.
The Federation has developed a humanoid weapon known as the Mobile Suit Gundam to combat the Zeon's powerful robots called Zaku's. Young Amuro Ray, son of an immigrant weapons engineer, has to quickly teach himself the operations of the Gundam under actual combat conditions.
Mothers protect and care for the safety of their children in many different ways.
Diet Pepsi. Try it. Someone will be watching.
Solely loyally tawa pona only wile pana etawa tawa sina kintawa wawa no capi solely loyally tawa kepa kintempo lili ona kintawa ampasuno and tawa ampamu.
Your International House of Pancakes. Nobody does breakfast like IHOP does breakfast.
Try IHOP's new savory steak entrees.
Hi, I'm Super Train Station H, and welcome to part 19 of Barrier Aggression, my critical analysis of Autism Confidential, the National Council on Severe Autism's podcast series, which is focused on their 39th episode. In episode 39 of the NCSA podcast, NCSA President Jill Escher, NCSA Board Member Dr. Lee Wachtel, and NCSA ally Dr. Carmen Lopez Arvizu hold an extended public indignation meeting denouncing an article by Spectrum News that discusses autistic doctors who are fighting against stigma and discrimination experienced by clinically diagnosed autistic people who were serving as doctors. In my series up to this point, I've already spent more than 20 hours breaking down in painful detail how the NCSA's president and other organization personalities, guests, and allies challenge the fundamental scientific validity of what some may call high-functioning autism, and in various ways described autistic people like the ones in the Spectrum News article of falsely claiming autism as part of a politically motivated, selfish conspiracy against actual autistic children and their parents. As for Spectrum News, Jill and her buddies presented it as a propaganda outlet so as to give the impression that it mass-produced biased hit-piece articles that demoted the goodwill and reputation of real autistics with real disabilities.
So I think we're going to talk about like just an example of how extreme and weird most of you people out there in the listener land have heard of Spectrum News. Spectrum News is published by the Simons Foundation. They regularly, really on a daily basis, on the weekdays at least, churn out news stories and features. And they have a very strong neurodiversity bias. They ran this article. Doctors with autism speak out against stigma. All right, so never mind the fact that neither of my children even understand what a doctor is. But, they use doctors with autism. And
if we're going to define this, or if it's defined as a spectrum, then allow the needle of the spectrum to move and allow the both extremes and the ones that are in the middle to be able to have a voice as well. Do not dominate the conversation because that is what bias is. And that's something that we don't talk about enough in this kind of articles like the Spectrum publishes. It is the bias.
But unfortunately, it just really bears no semblance to what autism was when it was initially described by Kanner, when it was studied in the 70s by Rudder, and all the research that we have on autism is not what currently people are terming autism.
Even though the people discussed in the article were diagnosed within a range of disability that was called severe and clinically significant, and that was umbrellaed under the pervasive developmental disorders subheading of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, along with what was at the time called autism over 30 years ago. All of this about an article that NCSA President Jill Escher only read the first 9% of to her podcast audience in isolation before denouncing the entire article as biased propaganda that did a disservice to who NCSA board member Dr. Lee Wachtel of the Kennedy Krieger Institute called truly autistic people.
And that does do a disservice to those who have, I guess, more classic or more true forms of autism.
A phrase which, by the way, bears no scientific or academic validity and is simply an expression of Lee's personal bias, only for these three stooges of advocacy to call the Spectrum article biased, simply for discussing high-functioning autistic people at all.
Spectrum News. Spectrum News is published by the Simons Foundation. They regularly, really on a daily basis, on the weekdays at least, churn out news stories and features. And they have a very, very strong neurodiversity bias in their reporting. I don't think anybody would disagree with me. Basically, all the researchers I talk to roll their eyes half the time at the features that appear in Spectrum News. Most people don't even read it anymore.
Do not dominate the conversation, because that is what bias is. And that's something that we don't talk about enough in this kind of articles like the Spectrum publishes. It is the bias. You are absolutely writing all these documents with the bias that
I won't mention names, but there are those quote-unquote autistic doctors. Of course, I don't see a speck of autism in these people, but whatever. Who have been antagonistic towards those who speak out on behalf of the severely affected. Kind of saying that we're not treating them with dignity, we're not treating them with respect, we're disparaging them, when all we're doing is communicating their reality. It's inherently awful. Their existence is inherently awful to these people.
Well, the NCSA and their allies certainly made it clear how they feel about Spectrum News. So why don't we read a few randomly selected Spectrum News headlines and determine how radical and biased they really are against supposedly true autistic people. Autism prevalence increasing in children, adults, according to electronic medical records. Easing sensory sensitivities in the clinic. Q&A with Lee Stein-Duker. BCL11 alpha related intellectual developmental disorder. Intervention dosage gray matter volume. Of course. Untangling biological threads from autism's phenotypic patchwork reveals 4 core subtypes. Brain organoid size matches intensity of social problems in autistic people. Some minimally verbal autistic people show signs of written language familiarity, study suggests. Synaptic anomalies in autistic people support imbalance hypothesis. Anti-vax blogger retracts critique of study that debunked vaccination autism link. Really? This is what the NCSA threw innocent autistic doctors under the bus to sound the alarm about. Come on. I mean, maybe me saying this makes me a radical autism revisionist, but these headlines, to me, suggest a rather ordinary output sample from an online newspaper about neurodevelopmental disability. Hell, I actually tried to read these articles, and as little as I could understand, the article about minimally verbal autistics possessing written language potential even has cautions about that study alone not providing total validation of certain forms of facilitated communication that the NCSA is outspokenly doubtful of the veracity of. I didn't cherry pick these. These were actually selected at random. But I would go as far as to say that if you, Jill, in regards to your podcast, had chosen to cherry pick at least half a dozen example articles to prove your point, something that you at least felt was a sample size that supported your position, even if I disagreed you overall, I wouldn't have blamed you for at least attempting to support your claims with evidence. But your chance for that is over, and now you just look silly. So all that's really left to do at this point is to finally read the rest of the Spectrum News article about autistic doctors, beyond the 9% they wanted us to know about, and find out what else the NCSA was hiding from its podcast audience, all while drumming up support for their cause, which includes the solicitation of tax-free charitable donations from the public so Jill and her pals can help autistic people, or at least those with so-called true autism. If this video, part 19 of my project, is your introduction to this series, my oh my, are you in for a crazy ride today. But please be warned, in all seriousness, it's gonna involve discussion of disability discrimination and discussion of mental health disasters. Here we go. At long last, we're actually going to read, after talking about a podcast relating to this article for more than 20 hours, Doctors with Autism Speak Out Against Stigma. Autistic clinicians have long hid their diagnoses from colleagues, but some are beginning to share their stories to ignite change. When Dr. Tahil Javed received a formal diagnosis for autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder at 27 years old, she felt shock, confusion, and relief. Certain reactions began to make sense, like all the times when she felt overwhelmed by noise on the bus and missed her stop, or when she had a full-blown panic attack after a challenging conversation at work. For as long as I can remember, I have not felt I belonged anywhere up until the diagnosis, she wrote in an email. Javed is a psychiatric doctor in the UK and has what is called high-functioning autism, she says, meaning that she is able to live independently but can have trouble with sensorial overload, communication, and expressing emotions. The condition is typically diagnosed later in life. Surveys estimate that about 1% of doctors, primarily general practitioners and psychiatrists, are autistic. Many hide their diagnosis from their colleagues because they worry they will be stigmatized. Well, we're officially 9% of the way through the article. Guess it's time to stop reading and start complaining for the next 20 minutes about how absurd the concept of an autistic doctor is and how extreme and weird these people are for writing this biased, resentful article mocking the struggles of truly disabled children. Right, Jill? What is it that you, as president of the NCSA, didn't want your podcast audience of NCSA supporters to see or hear? Let's find out, Jill, and keep reading. Continuing on at long last, many hide their diagnosis from colleagues because they fear they will be stigmatized. But as Baez pushes the mental health of some autistic doctors to the brink, others are taking a big step to open up about their diagnosis and advocate for change. Jill, I only read one sentence further than what you chose to read in your podcast. One fucking sentence. And there's already nothing that can convince me that you didn't take a strategic, calculated choice to stop reading exactly where you did to avoid even the slightest risk of your podcast audience realizing that this article wasn't about frivolous disability appropriating autism revisionist radicals who allegedly hated actual disabled people. Already at this point, I would say, Jill, that you owe everyone who donated to your group who happens not to hate autistic people other than their own children and wanted the NCSA to advocate for their kids and not to attack and defame unrelated disabled people, a refund and an apology. Anyway, many hide their diagnosis from their colleagues because they worry they will be stigmatized. But as bias pushes the mental health of some autistic doctors to the brink, others are taking a big step to open up about their diagnosis and advocate for change. Compared to even when I was diagnosed a few years ago, I had never heard anything about neurodiversity, says Sarah Bernard, a neurodivergent geriatrician in Australia. Neurodiversity refers to the concept that differences such as autism or ADHD are part of the normal variation in brain functioning. And it's so super exciting to see it become a hot topic, she says. Now, to be fair to Jill, the word natural, when applied to autism, seriously sets her off. Genuinely, emotionally triggers her for reasons I do not honestly, personally blame her for, even if they're rooted in misunderstanding. And I'd say that passages as innocuous as the one I just read from the article are probably mostly the reason why Jill may actually believe that this is a biased propaganda piece that's concealing the struggles of her children. Her being deceptive to make that point isn't justified, but I do think she genuinely believes that about this article, and that's why I think the reason is. I think there's a serious, sincere psychological reason based on her pain and suffering and life experiences of trying to support her children through their pain and suffering. That doesn't give her the excuse to take it out on unrelated autistic people, because the context in which the neurodiversity paradigm applies the words normal or natural to autism and adjacent neurodevelopmental concepts, it's not necessarily an implication of positivity. It's a recognition that these experiences of humanity and all of their associated drawbacks, benefits, difficulties, and peculiarities have existed within human beings throughout human history, and prior to their modern scientific conceptualization and categorization, and that they didn't spontaneously appear in the 20th century after countless millennia where all humans had identical brain profiles absent of difference or disability until vaccines or something came about out of nowhere and ruined everything. Jill rejects the vaccine conjecture, but as a principled position, Jill Escher does explicitly reject any non-synthetic origin for autism. Even people far, far closer than me to fitting the stereotype of the so-called neurodiversity warriors Jill and her friends complain about, including people I often don't even agree with on specific points, still reject the idea that natural and the context of the neurodiversity paradigm inherently means beneficial or positive. Anyway, back to the article. Bernard was diagnosed when she was 38. Like Javed, she found a lot of clarity afterward. Taking a phone call or speaking with a patient in a busy room was something that depleted her energy. She also says that she often felt misunderstood because her facial expressions didn't always match what she was feeling. The thing she dreaded the most was job interviews, which tended to go poorly because of their unpredictability and focus on social norms. Over the years, Bernard has found techniques to mitigate these challenges. I try to reduce the cognitive load by preparing a lot of scripts, she says. She often takes phone calls in quiet places and pays attention to her expressions and tone of voice while speaking to others. Now, I am more than aware that some would dismiss these as trivialized stress reduction tips and not coping techniques for clinically significant disorder.
So this is what Spectrum News considers to be autism. This is, and we just heard it, sensory overload, communication, and difficulty expressing emotions. Okay, that describes a lot of people I know who don't have autism. So this is what I want to pose to you guys.
And that's not what Kanner initially described. So autism is
most definitely not.
But they happen to be things that were included in many of my own occupational therapy sessions, and they're tantamount to many things that those coping techniques that are discussed by Jill's own high-functioning autistic friend, who was previously interviewed by Jill on a podcast prior to this one, and I really just consider her a bystander in that mess. I refuse to show gratuitous additional footage of this person, as they had only recently become an adult at the time of that interview, and their only crime was being friendly with someone who was nice to them, which for people like us can be harder to come by than it should be. But for some reason, Jill was happy to smile and listen when her high-functioning autistic friend, who happened to be an ally of the NCSA, discussed their autism coping techniques. But when reading about unrelated, high-functioning autistic strangers in a Spectrum News article, people that did not fit with the NCSA's agenda, in an article that Jill wanted to depict as an ideological radical hit piece about people who hate low-functioning autistics, Jill didn't even want to read about this type of stuff and allowed Dr. Arvizu to complain that people like Dr. Bernard and Dr. Javed need to stop being biased and canceling autistic people and their caregivers by appearing in these sorts of articles. And if you want proof of that, watch the previous 18 episodes of my series. But if you're pressed for time, I would say to start at part 14, which is somewhat of a high-speed recap of the first half of my project in the form of a countdown list, and work your way back up to 19 where you're at now. So anyway, moving on from the article. Although Bernard and Javed are able to adjust and talk openly about their struggles, many autistic doctors feel that the pressure to hide who they are out of fear that colleagues or employers will judge them or treat them differently. After Javed stepped forward with her diagnosis, she noticed that her peers would pay extra attention to her and ask if she was okay. That creates more anxiety, she says. We wish to be heard and accepted for who we are, but we don't necessarily want to be pointed out. Others worry that being linked to the condition may cost them their reputation as a reliable healthcare provider. They're already working so hard to get where they are, and rocking the boat sometimes just isn't worth it, says Lawrence Fung, a psychologist and director of the Stanford Neurodiversity Project. For instance, a UK-based general practitioner was released from their medical training program after they shared their condition. Their workplace issued the following statement, disclosed in a journal article in 2021.
The panel regrets to learn of your recent diagnosis of ASD, autism spectrum disorder. But since this is a lifelong developmental syndrome, which causes permanent impairment of many of the competencies required for independent practice as a general practitioner, the panel cannot see how any workplace adaptations could now be put in place to successfully alter your outcome.
Holy shit!
Jill, what the fuck is this?
An example of how extreme and weird most of you people out there in the listener land have heard of Spectrum News. They ran this article. Doctors with autism speak out against stigma. Never mind the fact that neither of my children even understand what a doctor is. But, they use doctors with autism. And
it's become sadly almost like faddish for individuals who have the types of challenges that are described in that article to adopt the term of, to identify as being autistic. Autism had taken on kind of this character of almost like a fantasy, a gift, it's special to be this way, and that they can also pawn off as a very positive thing. And I think it gives people kind of a lot of an out in a way. way. And that does do a disservice to those who have, I guess, more classic or more true forms of autism.
Almost canceling anyone that has a different opinion now that we are in the new, modality of canceling people that we disagree with.
How many doctors have you met who you would diagnose with autism?
None.
The one in, what was that, Grey's Anatomy? There was one.
Oh, the one on TV.
Yeah.
The TV doctor, right, who doesn't exist in real life. I won't mention names, but there are those quote unquote autistic doctors. Of course, I don't see a speck of autism in these people, but whatever. Who have been antagonistic towards those who speak out on behalf of the severely affected. Like, it's inherently awful. Like, their existence is inherently awful to these people. What about another diagnosis for, these people who are so super functional, so super successful? They don't really have, severe social communication problems. What about another diagnosis? I mean, like, is there anything in the book that could be applied instead of autism, some kind of personality disorder?
Jill, either get out of disability advocacy or close up the donations page on the NCSA website and fund your hate group bullshit out of pocket instead of asking for money from the parents of disabled children, endowing you to advocate for their kids' safety and understanding, only to use it for this bullshit. You aren't a legitimate autism advocate, Jill Escher, and I'm not saying that you aren't a legitimate autism advocate because you aren't autistic. And I'm also not saying that you aren't a legitimate autism advocate because you specialize in advancing public visibility and understanding of high support needs autistic people. I'm saying that you aren't a legitimate autism advocate because you used your autism advocacy nonprofit, funded at least in part by tax-free charitable donations, to defame and ridicule innocent autistic people for speaking out against getting fired for being autistic, all due to you getting personally upset that they're attempting careers that your biased ass thinks are too prestigious for autistic people to be involved in. If that's not what you're doing, Jill, you need to provide an in-depth explanation as to why you chose to use this article as the foundation for a 40-minute podcast discussion about how extreme and weird autism discourse had become by even suggesting that autistic people could become doctors. If I had a high support needs disabled child and I found out that my charitable donation to you might have paid for the microphone you used to record this shit, I would be on the phone with my credit card company right fucking now, because unlike tips, donations typically, according to credit card and payment processing company definitions, are negotiable for a refund. And that's what any supporter of yours, unaware of this shit, that supported you with their money deserves right now.
So I think we're going to talk about like just an example of how extreme and weird this whole kind of, vocabulary fail has been. And I consider autism to be a complete vocabulary fail. They ran this article. Doctors with autism speak out against stigma.
Jill, the failure of the definition of the word autism to remain stagnant throughout decades of research and inquiry and ongoing science, and the fact that the word autism fails to cater to your preferences for what you would like it to mean so it could best serve your personal agenda, cannot nearly be as much of a failure as the fact that in the very article you're complaining about for allegedly marginalizing and canceling your autistic children. An innocent autistic person was fired because their employers learned that they were professionally diagnosed with characteristics of neurodevelopmental disability within the range of today's autism spectrum disorder. Those being, whether you like them or not, characteristics of neurodevelopmental disability that were considered clinically legitimate as being umbrellaed under the same pervasive developmental disorders subheading of the DSM, which I remind my audience is the same subheading of the old autistic disorder definition over 30 fucking years ago. Whether those characteristics had the word autism in their formal title at any given point since the early 1990s or not.
So I think we're going to talk about like just an example of how extreme and weird.
You know what's really weird and extreme, Jill? The fact that you chose to use an article about clinically diagnosed, high-functioning autistic people getting fucking fired for revealing their diagnosis to validate a discussion about how relatively higher-functioning autistic people are suppressing or marginalizing anyone, let alone your relatively lower-functioning autistic children.
We are going to define this, or if it's defined as a spectrum, then allow the needle of the spectrum to move and allow both extremes and the ones that are in the middle to be able to have a voice as well. Do not dominate the conversation, because that is what bias is. And that's something that we don't talk about enough in this kind of articles like the Spectrum publishes. It is the bias.
How could you possibly believe that this is proof of high-functioning autistic people, as you call us, dominating anyone or anything? This is proof of us being dominated by non-disabled people who think that disabled people, as a natural matter of fact, don't belong in their fields of employment. And what did your ally, Dr. Carmen Lopez Arvizu, and actual NCSA board member, Dr. Lee Wachtel, have to say to these people who were speaking out against getting fucking fired over their autism diagnoses?
What in your view, what would be the ideal step forward here? Thinking.
I had a simple answer for that, but the reality is that we need to start talking about bias and to make sure that we share that with everyone. That there needs to be more inclusive opinions. That there needs to be inclusion of opinions that might not be necessarily supportive of your theory, but that we need to have a conversation and a civilized conversation, not when one of the parties is afraid to speak because being afraid of being your career destroyed, because that is the reality of things. People are afraid to talk.
But ultimately,
unfortunately, amongst a lot of professionals, I think that Carmen and I are probably a lot more willing than others to speak out, speak the truth. But many people are not, because they don't want to be canceled. They don't want to, they don't want to get in trouble.
It's what bias is. It is the bias that we need to start talking about bias.
You know what's fucking biased, Jill? What's biased is that you read the first 9% of an article about how entitled and irrational the people featured in it are for falsely self-identifying and facetiously claiming to be autistic. When just 6% further into that article, it discusses how those same people are being instantly fired from their fucking jobs and training programs for being clinically diagnosed with autism. It doesn't matter what me or you or NeuroCat2007 on fucking Tumblr think about self-diagnosis. How the fuck does the president of a national organization for autism advocacy read an article about autistic people being fired for being diagnosed with autism and think that the problem is not that these people were fired for being autistic, but that the problem was somehow that these people were able to be diagnosed in the first place? No wonder you stopped reading only 9% of the way through the article, Jill Escher. You malicious fucking coward.
And, just recently, I'm going to do a little bit of reading here. They ran this article.
A little bit of reading is right, Jill, because you only read 9% of the article. Jill, your episode 39 of your evil podcast series was 55 minutes and 32 seconds long. How the fuck would you feel, Jill, if I only listened to 9% of your podcast episode before I started ranting and raving about how awful it was? If I did to your shit show podcast what you, Jill, did to the Spectrum News article about autistic doctors, my entire criticism of your podcast would have been based on less than the first 5 minutes of what you and your friends had to say. But no, I listened to this 55-minute and 32-second long podcast hundreds of times, many of those in slow motion, and I separated it into 5-minute segments, which I listened to individually on loops tens of dozens of times. I can quote nearly your entire hour-long podcast episode from memory because I wanted to be certain that I understood what you and your friends had to say without misunderstanding, even when I didn't agree with any of it. And I didn't do something that obsessive sounding because I don't like you. I did not do that because I was determined to dig up dirt on you, Jill. I did that because that's what it takes for me as a person with clinically recognized, professionally observed deficits and understanding other people to be fully confident that I was comprehending you, saying things that didn't make any fucking sense in a way similar to how a typical person would after listening to it only once. And you couldn't bother to spare 10 fucking minutes to read this article to your podcast audience before you started lying your ass off to defame and denounce innocent autistic people as the enemies of your defenseless children. And that's a best case scenario for you, in which I would be so charitable as to pretend that you didn't know exactly what you were fucking doing, didn't know exactly what the article contained in its entirety, and didn't strategically stop exactly where you did 9% of the way in so that you could go on to make this shit show and feed it to your podcast, pretending it to be the truth about autism, to defend your autistic children from irrational partisans who hate them.
Presents individuals who are very impaired, the vast majority of whom have concomitant intellectual disability, minimal to no language. They can't dress themselves, they can't toilet themselves, they cannot make any type of decisions. Maybe they can choose between having a vanilla and a strawberry ice cream. They can't live independently. They're never going to be able to do any of those things that these other individuals, like physicians who claim they have autism, can do. I mean, those individuals, I really, when I hear that type of garbage, I feel like, inviting them, okay, well, you know what, we're always short of direct care staff on a neurobehavioral unit. So if you'd like to come and work with some of my patients and talk to them about like running for office or what type of job that they'd like to have and how they're going to purchase an apartment, have at it.
Yeah, I totally see your point. I mean, I won't mention names, but there are those quote unquote autistic doctors. Of course, I don't see a speck of autism in these people, but whatever, who have been antagonistic towards those who speak out on behalf of the severely affected. Kind of saying that we're not treating them with dignity, we're not treating them with respect, we're disparaging them, when all we're doing is communicating their reality. Like, it's inherently awful. Like, their existence is inherently awful to these people.
If you, as the president of the National Council on Severe Autism, making a spectacle of leading your organization to the steps of the Capitol, can't be trusted to truthfully and accurately present a 2-page online news article to your podcast audience of supporters, how the fuck is the general public, let alone the autistic community, supposed to trust you to truthfully and accurately present legislative proposals that will impact the lives and rights of autistic people, including people who are unable to understand what a legislative proposal is?
Neither of my children even understand what a doctor is.
Fuck you, Jill. Autism isn't a private club that you, who is not a fucking doctor, get to pick and choose who's safe and legitimate for being present within. Autism isn't a privilege for people that you happen to like, or people whose state of being, which they did not choose for themselves, happens to coincide with your personal agenda. And that's a lesson that you, along with a few too many self-proclaimed neurodiversity advocates, need to learn the hard way. And trust me, Jill, I did not start this project because I wanted to voice my vendetta against the NCSA over this podcast. That may be what this project turned into, but that's not what it started as. Because if I heard on TikTok or Tumblr from someone else that the National Council on Severe Autism took an article about autistic people protesting after getting fired from their jobs and employment training programs when their diagnoses were discovered by their employers, and twisted that into being a hit piece about fake autistic people, canceling suppressing truly autistic children, I, as a sincere matter of fact, would have never bothered looking into this at all. Because if I had heard some shit like that on TikTok or Tumblr, the latter of which I've been a member of for a fucking decade at this point, and know inside and out more than I'd like to, if I heard it there from someone I didn't already trust that you did this, I would have assumed, based on experience, that if someone I didn't know on Tumblr or TikTok, Tumblr in specific, I don't know much about TikTok, whatever, had said some shit like this, I would have assumed they were pushing a biased agenda against your group. Because this is too extreme to be believed. Even knowing the kind of fucked up things that partisans do against disabled people, organizing against us, actually conspiring against us, even being vividly aware of that, even being a person who has had document fraud committed against me, by someone who was so upset by the fact that someone as normal seeming as me needed disability resources. Even having gone through that, I still would not have believed that the National Council on Severe Autism, or even a selected handful of people acting independently within it, would do some shit like this. I wouldn't have believed it. But somehow, I discovered this by accident, completely on my own. Because trust me, Jill, I did not start looking into the NCSA thinking that some crazy shit like this would be laying in plain fucking sight, to be discovered by the first person paying even the slightest attention, and go totally undiscussed by the so-called neurodiversity warriors who you say can't stop targeting you with artificial complaints. And believe me, for well and beyond a year since I discovered this, I've been combing the internet for any mentions from neurodiversity proponents and self-advocates of this podcast. And even the handful who've covered it have not discussed the points that I've discussed so far and will be discussing in the future.
Doctors with autism speak out against stigma. All right, so never mind the fact that neither of my children even understand what a doctor is. But, these doctors with autism. And
I don't care how many times I need to point this out. You're laughing at people who are objectively and literally within the same categories of clinically diagnosed neurodevelopmental disability as autistic people you've invited on your show as friends and respected allies of the NCSA, whether they choose to identify as autistic or not. And I really can't believe that you, with the help of your Dr. lackeys from the Kennedy Krieger Institute, who I'm sure are proud to be associated with this shit, have landscaped yourselves into an ideological ditch where you, Jill, can grant your useless, meaningless blessing and best wishes to at least one high-functioning autistic person, as they so call themselves, who self-identifies with a non-clinically recognized disability term, while holding autistic strangers in public contempt for describing themselves in line with their clinically administered diagnostic terminology. Even if I had dug up a stray tweet from years ago where you complained about this, it would have been worth talking about. But you dedicated a 40-minute podcast segment using your autism advocacy nonprofit to complain about the fact that people were describing themselves in line with their clinically administered diagnostic terminology. You made that the basis of an indignation meeting against the self-diagnosis of autism? Disability self-identification absent of official authority? That literally didn't happen. And the document that is the source of your grievances. And I don't like to help people who I would consider enemies. But Jill, if you had went on Tumblr for 15 minutes or TikTok for 5 minutes and found some random shit post from some unvetted random person calling themselves a neurodiversity proponent who said objectively incorrect shit, you could have made between 50 and 60% of the arguments you made in this podcast against that post. And it would have been, in many ways, potentially legitimate criticism. But because you cared more about attacking the fundamental principle of the clinical legitimacy of autistic people other than your own high support needs, aka lower functioning children, and you cared more about attacking Spectrum News, possibly because they failed to announce your organization's arrival on the autism scene with glowing praise. You did this shit and totally debased yourself. And people who are just trying to help their autistic friends and family members who might have dedicated their time, their money, and their reputations to being associated with you, even indirectly. the NCSA, which is partially funded by charitably donated money, thanks to Jill's asshole bullshit, has used their platform to denounce innocent autistic people on the basis of purely imaginary claims made up by someone who and I, in the utmost seriousness, personally consider to be sincerely deluded in regards to this matter.
So I think the caveat to that would be, in my line of work on the neurobehavioral unit over the 20 years that I've been in the field, autism still represents individuals who are very impaired, the vast majority of whom have concomitant intellectual disability, minimal to no language, very significant comorbidities, whether those are psychiatric, medical, genetic, or combined, and who are going to require significant supports for the rest of their life, will never live independently, earn a living wage, run for office, drive a car, do any of those things, and certainly not attend university. But I think outside of my inpatient unit, what I've started to see, society at large, is not only an explosion in the number of people who are not only diagnosed with autism by professionals, but also self-diagnosed and have adopted autism almost as a form of an identity, in a way to explain themselves to themselves, or a way to kind of explain the unique way in which they interact with the world. But those individuals really have very little to nothing in common with the types of individuals that I work with.
It's like Lee Wachtel is literally unable to accept that people outside of her neurobehavioral unit at Kennedy Krieger Institute could also have valid neurodevelopmental disabilities. How is this person, a person of authority at a hospital for disabled children? This makes no fucking sense.
It's become sadly almost like faddish to, for individuals who have the types of challenges that are described in that article, to adopt the term of, to identify as being autistic.
Lee, what fetish are you aware of that involves making shit up that gets you fucking fired by disability bigots that you're under the authority of? I know the internet is pretty wild, but I haven't stumbled across that subject of interest yet, Lee.
And I think that, in sharp contrast to many patients with autism, particularly the ones that Dr. Lopez and I work with, autism has taken on kind of this character of almost like a fantasy, a gift. It's special to be this way, and you bring something special and unique to the world that other people don't have, and it's become kind of cool and interesting to be neurodivergent. It's special to be this way. It's special to be this way.
Do you think that getting fucking fired by your employer, as the direct result of them learning of your disability background, made anyone feel fucking special, Lee? Because that's what's in the article that you're saying this in response to.
It seems that a lot of people, rather than perhaps looking more deeply at the crux of the issues that they're experiencing, have happily taken on this moniker of autism as something that explains the challenges that they feel that they have, and that they can also pawn off as a very positive thing.
These people aren't trying to use their diagnoses to demand a labor-free life at taxpayers' expense. They're doing the exact opposite of that. They're taking on expensive, time-consuming educational endeavors to enter difficult and demanding fields. They're eagerly pushing the limits of their potential for self-reliance. And somehow you're pissed at them because they could do things that your patients can't, in spite of them still needing some level of external support? Why?
I think it gives people kind of a lot of an out in a way. to take on this term and erase any type of negativity or association of a challenge with what they're experiencing. But unfortunately, it just really bears no semblance to what autism was when it was initially described by Kanner, when it was studied in like the 70s by Rudder. And I mean, all the like research that we have on autism is not what currently people are terming autism. And that does do a disservice to those who have, I guess, more classic or more true forms of autism. And they're also able to achieve so many more things. I mean, just thinking about somebody who's been through medical school, that means that they succeeded at a very high level throughout their secondary education. They succeeded at a high level in college, and then they went on to medical school. They completed a residency. They functioned and succeeded at an extremely high level.
Yes, they did function and succeed at a high level. Until they got fucking fired over their disability backgrounds. So they're speaking out against it. And you, Wachtell, are upset at them for daring to speak out against the bigotry they face, which has been proven to put their careers at risk.
You know,
well, the people with high functioning autism, like those individuals in many of those articles, don't want autism to be in the DSM. That's like one of the goals of some of these advocates, is that it should be removed from the DSM in the same way that homosexuality was removed from the DSM like a half century ago. So if they don't want it to be seen as a disorder, well, great, pick another term for it and, like, you know, go on your merry way. Right, they don't want it in the DSM, but they just. You know, I think like at some point, some form of like reason has to prevail. I think that we're stuck in the United States with like skewing reality for a lot of fantasy on many levels. And at some point that like needs to stop. Particularly when it comes to, you know, it's just the whole thing of like fighting for equality, equity, and like equal rights for everybody. It's like I always say, you cannot fight for like, you know, racial equity and like spout anti-Semitism at the same time. That's incongruous, and if you act like that, you're just a hypocrite. And I think it's the same thing when you're advocating for rights for people with disability. If you want to advocate for yourself as somebody with high functioning autism, at the end of the day, you're just a hypocrite.
How is anyone supposed to listen to you in this situation and not perceive you as a disability bigot? Or perhaps somehow catastrophically misinformed by someone who may have misrepresented this article to you. If they did, you might want to consider their options and being held accountable, because this does not look good for you or the institution that you're representing.
And I don't really have a problem so far. I mean, anybody can call himself whatever he wants. I mean, at the end of the day, that's like, you know, their business.
You don't have a problem with them calling themselves whatever they want? Lee, not only were their doctors the one to give them these labels, and not themselves, but you very provably do have some kind of a problem with it.
You know, it's just the whole thing of like fighting for equality, equity, and like equal rights for everybody. It's like I always say, you cannot fight for like, you know, racial equity and like spout anti-Semitism at the same time. That's incongruous, and if you act like that, you're just a hypocrite.
How the fuck do you participate in a 40-minute long public indignation meeting revolving around an article about specific people who you compare to anti-Semitic racists, and then pretend that you somehow don't have a problem with them? You seem to understand somehow that admitting that you have a problem with these people might make you seem unfashionable, but you don't seem to understand why. You're the kind of person who would reach out into a fire and get burned and think that you got burned because it was red and not because it's hundreds of degrees Fahrenheit and damages human skin tissue. And I'm not trying to convince you or anyone else that neurodiversity should be the monolithic ideology of all disability discourse. Even I don't believe that myself, as someone who displays neurodiversity symbols proudly. I just want you to stop going out of your way to not only vilify disabled strangers for not being exactly like your own patients, and I want you to stop implying that the existence of high-functioning autistic people is a recently invented farce that makes the lives of your severely autistic patients, as you call them, worse.
And I don't really have a problem so far. I mean, anybody can call himself whatever he wants. I mean, at the end of the day, that's like, their business. But the issue really becomes then when people have adopted this term, and for some reason, people who have adopted the term, the identity as autism, take great offense at the idea that some people who are classified also as having autism cannot do the things that they can do. The issue really becomes then when people have adopted this term, and for some reason, people who have adopted the term, the identity as autism,
Lee, fuck adoption of identity. You can fuck identity, no matter what your opinion on self-identification of autism is. The article you're saying this in response to is not about people advocating for the self-identification of autism, but it just so happens that you and your co-panelists incorrectly, repeatedly insinuating this gives you a much stronger foundation to challenge these people's credibility, which seems to be the goal of this podcast episode far more than a discussion over the precision and accuracy of disability language.
And for some reason, people who have adopted the term, the identity as autism, take great offense at the idea that some people who are classified also as having autism cannot do the things that they can do. As if like saying that, well, I have autism and I'm a physician. They can't recognize, they don't want to recognize, it offends them, it upsets them to imagine that some people who have a diagnosis of autism need somebody to take care of them 24 hours a day. They can't dress themselves, they can't toilet themselves, they cannot make any type of decisions. Maybe they can choose between having a vanilla and a strawberry ice cream. They can't live independently. They're never going to be able to do any of those things that these other individuals, like physicians who claim they have autism, can do.
Fuck you!
Fuck you. Fuck you.
People do need to have a little bit more guts in terms of speaking up and standing like for the truth. But it's hard. It is definitely hard because nobody is really protected, and we do live in a society where ultimately like identity cannot be touched.
Lee, all you do is touch these people's identities. And not only do you touch their identities, you confiscate their actual diagnostic terminology assigned to them by licensed professionals and accuse them of having stolen these labels from suffering children. Even if you don't care about respecting autistic people other than your own patients, you would think that respecting your fellow clinicians in the medical and psychiatric community by respecting their assessments of patients they've actually personally worked with would have held you back from saying reckless shit like this. And even aside from that, there are very few things you can say about someone that will cause them to be disliked, which are more serious than accusations against them of their having stolen from disabled children, and the fact that you, for some reason, described the alleged misbehavior from the autistic adults in the article as a fetish would certainly lead some to interesting speculation on how you'd like the outside world to perceive and treat the innocent people you're targeting with this propaganda, especially in a 2025 political climate when accusations of pedophilia are being used to harass, assault, and criminalize people for being different or unusual in any way. And then you have the nerve to say that you don't mind them calling themselves autistic, when not only is that provably untrue, but you never had any authority to grant or deny them permission or approval to be autistic in the first place.
People do need to have a little bit more guts in terms of speaking up and standing like for the truth. But it's hard. It is definitely hard because nobody is really protected, and we do live in a society where ultimately like identity cannot be touched, and people are able to claim whatever identity they want. And the minute you start to suggest
what, Lee? That they get another fucking job because autistic people don't belong in careers that might risk reflecting some element of accomplishment?
Yeah, I think like at some point, some form of like reason has to prevail. I think that we're stuck in the United States with like skewing reality for a lot of fantasy on many levels. And at some point that like needs to stop.
Fuck off to England and try your reality retracting fantasy bullshit on His Majesty King Charles Philip Arthur George, who identifies as the King of England just because he happens to be the King of fucking England, as minor technicalities like that clearly aren't enough to get in your way. You know for a fact that families have literally fled from authoritarian dictatorships to put their children under your care and judgment to make the mere hope for a partially peaceful life of intermittent safety possible for their children. I wouldn't know that unless I cared on digging into your background and trying to understand your perspective on autism. It does not make me happy to find out that someone I should be celebrating as an undoubted hero could have fucked up this bad and have this ugly and toxic of an attitude about autistic people who happen to need less help than what you deal in providing.
And that does do a disservice to those who have, I guess, more classic or more true forms of autism.
And I want you to get out of this office right now.
I'm sorry, Zeb.
No way.
You brought you brought it on yourself.
I don't want you here.
I'm so sorry, George. I didn't think it would go like this.
Out.
Ted, I got your voucher.
So, that's exactly the issue, the classic definition of autism. I don't see a problem with some people identifying their differences or labeling themselves neurodivergent. It's fine. We all have our little quirks and our little differences, and that's fine. However, the use of the word autism, it's taken to the extremes because we need it for policymaking, for accessing services, for accessing education.
Carmen, this article had nothing to do with people passing off minor personality quirks as disabilities, and many disabled people in situations like the ones in the article you're bitching about only got that far because they'd been professionally diagnosed and thus had access to some of the same services you're accusing them of not even possibly needing and of interfering with access to just by calling themselves autistic in line with their clinically administered diagnoses in this case. And many others never made it that far because they hadn't been diagnosed when they needed to be, and they slipped through the cracks of a system that's already stretched to its limit and is still, in spite of decades of progress, riddled with biases and societal problems that prevent people from getting the help they need because they don't fit very specific economic, racial, and social archetypes. And when people like that get embraced by the autistic community, and if they receive professional diagnosis later in life, you've made it a principal goal of yours by acting in this way to encourage public dislike of them.
What in your view, what would be the ideal step forward here? Thinking.
Wish I had a simple answer for that. But, the reality is that we need to start talking about bias and to make sure that we share that with everyone, that there needs to be more inclusive opinions, that there needs to be inclusion of opinions that might not be necessarily supportive of your theory.
I don't care about your hollow theories.
Fuck that, Carmen. You're not going to misrepresent objective facts about the actual history of autism and possible manifestations of clinically authenticated autistic disabilities and capabilities that have been recorded realities since before you became a doctor as being the mere personal theories of radical neurodiversity proponents who want to take the word autism away from actual disabled people who really need disability services and special education. Carmen, you don't get to literally exclude us from the actual disability of autism and then accuse us of being biased towards you and say that we're the ones unwilling to be inclusive towards your idea, your biased idea that we aren't valid as disabled people, all while you use your position of authority within a children's disability hospital to pretend to write autistic adults out of the history of autism as recorded by sources with no allegiance or affiliation with the neurodiversity movement at all.
We need to start talking about bias and to make sure that we share that with everyone, that there needs to be more inclusive opinions, that there needs to be inclusion of opinions that might not be necessarily supportive of your theory, but that we need to have a conversation and a civilized conversation, not when one of the parties is afraid to speak because being afraid of being your career destroyed, because that is the reality of things. People are afraid to talk.
It's an absolute fucking farce that you somehow think that high-functioning autistic people, that we are excluding your opinions and making you afraid to talk by appearing in this article that you are responding to and kept referring back to. You are lying, or at best, acting on incredible misinformation that you recklessly failed to verify and follow up on. By acting in apparent or actual ignorance of essential facts about the article that you then went on to use as the basis to insist that these people aren't facing challenges worthy of being considered disabilities, but instead are just minor personality quirks that everyone has, when the reality is that these people are being excluded from society and essential aspects of society critical to them attaining the self-reliance that they may be capable of actually achieving, because their employers, their co-workers, and their training program directors found out that they are clinically diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, while you insist that they're making you afraid for fear of having your career destroyed, and that you and Lee are uniquely courageous for having the courage to stand up about the truth of autism.
Not when one of the parties is afraid to speak because being afraid of being your career destroyed, because that is the reality of things. People are afraid to talk.
But ultimately,
unfortunately, amongst a lot of professionals, I think that Carmen and I are probably a lot more willing than others to speak out, speak the truth. But many people are not, because they don't want to be canceled, and they don't want to get in trouble.
Not when one of the parties is afraid to speak because being afraid of being your career destroyed, because that is the reality of things. People are afraid to talk.
Autistic people for generations have been afraid to talk because, as the article you're bitching about discusses, and parts that your courageous president was too cowardly to present to her audience, mention just discussing their diagnoses in public can get them fucking fired or kicked out of school and training programs. And now, for the first time, autistic people and disabled people in general have barely enough of a voice and organized form to speak out against this shit and be somewhat safe in doing so. And you think that them organizing is some kind of a problem, and that them losing their fucking jobs and educations somehow counts as them treating you unfairly when they organized against that.
I think we are seeing more and more of the ability of some individuals to speak very strongly about their feelings about the diagnosis and the past definitions and past implications, and kind of almost canceling anyone that has a different opinion now that we are in the new, modality of canceling people that we disagree with. So it has limited the ability to have an open conversation and kind of be collaboratively working together instead of being so antagonistic. That's what it has become, a very antagonistic conversation instead of a collaborative effort. There's so many of the people we serve that will never be able to even understand what a word doctor is. So that is what the conversation should be about. Do not dominate the conversation, because that is what bias is. And that's something that we don't talk about enough in this kind of articles like the Spectrum publishes. It is the bias. And I think, canceling the people that speak for that lower end of the spectrum, you are canceling these individuals that cannot really speak for themselves, but not giving or allowing the opinion of the ones that care for them. You are doing exactly what you think they're doing to you. So, that is the problem. That is the bias. That is the narrow view of this concept. I'm not speaking for the medical profession. I'm speaking from my experience as a child psychiatrist and from my experience and treating individuals in the autism spectrum.
Get out of my courtroom!
A pleasure.
Surveys estimate that about 1% of doctors, primarily GPs and psychiatrists, are autistic. Many hide their diagnosis from their colleagues because they worry they will be stigmatized.
That sarcastic, condescending inflection, and the way Jill said stigmatized, is that much fucking nastier, knowing that just half a page deeper into the article is presented an actual termination letter that an autistic doctor received upon the disclosure of their diagnosis.
Surveys estimate that about 1% of doctors, primarily GPs and psychiatrists, are autistic. Many hide their diagnosis from their colleagues because they worry they will be stigmatized. Never mind that the fact the survey they're referring to was conducted by a ideological group, and I think it was very, very questionable methods, but nevertheless.
Imagine how deep someone's hatred must be against a population for that person to hear a statistic that 1% of their disliked group were involved in a certain respected profession, and their knee-jerk reaction is to think, what? 1%? There's absolutely no way there could be that many. A radical agenda-driven ideological group is inflating those numbers to overpresent these people's presence in the field.
Vegeta, what does the scouter say about his power level? It's over
1%.
What?
1%.
There's no way that can be right.
Holy shit.
So this is what Spectrum News considers to be autism. This is, and we just heard it, sensory overload, communication, and difficulty expressing emotions. Okay, that describes a lot of people I know who don't have autism. So this is what I want to pose to you guys.
And that's not what Canner initially described. So autism is
most definitely not.
Well, Jill, whether you think it describes autism or not, it certainly describes your clinically diagnosed autistic friend who you happen to find acceptable to describe as autistic, whether they self-identify with the old Asperger's label that they never clinically received or not. Jill Escher, who is not a fucking doctor, really seems to believe that being the president of alleged autism advocacy nonprofit gives her the actual authority to permit people to openly describe themselves as existing within the semantic space of neurodevelopmental disability known as autism, and also the authority to confiscate the diagnoses of strangers if they don't appeal to Jill's sensibilities of those she would prefer to be seen within the same sympathetic light as her own autistic children. And that's fucked up to the point where I refuse to even utter the name of Jill's autistic friend, who I consider a bystander in all of this.
So I'm curious, you guys, you've had long careers in medicine. How many doctors have you met who you would diagnose with autism?
None.
The one in, what was that, Grey's Anatomy? There was one.
Oh, the one on TV.
Yeah.
The TV doctor, right, who doesn't exist in real life.
Imagine how easy it is to laugh and how absurd it is that there exists such a thing as an autistic doctor when you're making this joke in direct fucking response to an article about the fact that being a doctor and mentioning to your superiors and co-workers that you're autistic can get you instantly fucking fired. Jill, that could be your friend in a few years. Your autistic friend who you encourage to become a clinical psychiatrist and join the fucking DSM committee that literally decides who is and is not officially autistic. Hey Jill, just a little speculation here from a cartoon dog. I somehow doubt that a psychology professor that might happen to say and believe things of the nature of your fellow podcast panelist and NCSA board member, Dr. Lochtel, and this podcast episode would be especially fond of a vocally articulate, academically thriving young person showing up in class, potentially with a service dog at their side and a letter saying that they were diagnosed with a relatively recently codified form of autism that the professor happens to believe is so trivialized to be an insult to the very history of inquiry into autism. And Jill, you might not have guessed this, but I don't fucking like you, and I don't fucking respect you. For reasons that I've still refrained from revealing to those watching my videos. Even though for some naive Pollyanna-ass reason, I still don't hate you. But no matter how fitting it would be, from a certain perspective that I don't like to consider, I sincerely hope that you never have to find out from your younger autistic friend, or perhaps some other autistic supporters of yours who haven't made public appearances in NCSA materials. What happens to people like them when those with authority, like your board member on the NCSA, Lee Wachtel, take out their proven bias and preconceptions about disability and disabled people out on students who are seeking fair treatment and academic settings designed for non-disabled people?
You can't say that those people are discounted or that their diagnosis isn't real, or come up with all sorts of other nonsense statements like, well, actually those people are just as high functioning as I am. It's a societal issue, or you don't know how to understand them. And if you listen to me, I mean, those individuals, I really, when I hear that type of garbage, I feel like, inviting them, okay, well, you know what, we're always short of direct care staff on the neurobehavioral unit. So if you'd like to come and work with some of my patients and talk to them about running for office or what type of job that they'd like to have and how they're going to purchase an apartment, have at it.
Yeah, I totally see your point. I mean, I won't mention names, but there are those quote unquote autistic doctors. Of course, I don't see a speck of autism in these people, but whatever, who have been antagonistic towards those who speak out on behalf of the severely affected. It's inherently awful. Their existence is inherently awful to these people. Anyway, I won't elaborate on that too much, but
I only read 7% further into the article than Jill did, and that additional 7% somehow made the three panelists, in my opinion, go from appearing to merely being badly informed and obviously biased to looking like obvious malicious shitheads who fibbed out their butts about an article that concerned innocent autistic people speaking out against actual persecution. How much worse can it get? Let's find out. And let's skip ahead about half a page, because if Jill can pick and choose what part of this article she wants to analyze to prove her point, and so can I. But the difference is, I'm actually going to provide a link to the article so my viewers can read it in its entirety for themselves, instead of making shit up and hoping that my audience will just assume that I'm not lying about the source of the material after reading less than 10% of it to them. Studies have found that people with autism often lack support in the workplace, which can affect their mental health. For instance, autistic people are 4 times more likely to develop depression than those without autism. Almost half have severe anxiety. These challenges can sometimes compound into suicidal thoughts. Up to 66% of adults with Asperger's syndrome, a diagnosis that has since been subsumed into the larger category of autism spectrum disorder, have thought about taking their own life, and 35% have attempted suicide, according to a 2014 study at the University of Cambridge in the UK. What the fuck is wrong with you, Jill? A 40-minute public indignation meeting about this is what you consider authentic awareness and the truth about autism? Why? Do you hate us that fucking much? And you think we're the ones who hate your autistic children?
So the people at that very, very high end of autism who are super privileged, right? They want
their autism, you kind of see their autism as all autism. They seem blinded to the vast heterogeneity and the vast, really, dysfunction in the large part of the autism community. So there's that. Like, it's inherently awful. Like, their existence is inherently awful to these people. Anyway, I won't elaborate on that too much. But the social quirks are in the same category, the same diagnostic category as my kids.
And like, that's a problem.
It's absurd. It's not just a problem. I mean, it's violently absurd. It's radically absurd. Is there anything in the book that could be applied instead of autism, some kind of personality disorder?
It seems a lot more like you hate us and don't care what happens to us, Jill. This is what you call autism advocacy? Using charitably donated funds to do so? Isn't it amazing how 60% of the way into an article that the National Council on Severe Autism only wanted their audience to hear the first 9% of, discusses that people who formerly might have been considered Asperger's patients, who are now autism spectrum disorder probably level 1, have considered suicide, with around half of them having actually attempted it. That's pretty serious to me, Jill. Maybe that just makes me a radical neurodiversity partisan. And what did Jill and her friends from the NCSA have to say after reading from that article?
An example of how extreme and weird, most of you people out there in the listener land have heard of Spectrum News. They ran this article. Doctors with autism speak out against stigma. Never mind the fact that neither of my children even understand what a doctor is. But, they use doctors with autism. And
it's become sadly almost like faddish for individuals who have the types of challenges that are described in that article to adopt the term of, to identify as being autistic. Autism had taken on kind of this character of almost like a fantasy, a gift, it's special to be this way, and that they can also pawn off as a very positive thing. And I think it gives people kind of a lot of an out in a way to take on this term and erase any type of negativity or association of a challenge with what they're experiencing. And that does do a disservice to those who have, I guess, more classic or more true forms of autism.
That is what bias is. And, that's something that we don't talk about enough in this kind of articles like the Spectrum publishes. It is the bias. You are absolutely writing all these documents with the bias.
Oh, right. Since the discussion of those autistic suicide stats was only 60% of the way through the article, and Jill strategically only read the first 9%, so her and her friends could misrepresent the article as being a bunch of non-disabled complainers with no problems or serious challenges that were appropriating disability terminology from real autistic children and patients and disrespecting their struggles through cancel culture.
Almost canceling anyone that has a different opinion now that we are in the new, modality of canceling people that we disagree with.
Regarding cancellation, action to cancel those, wishing to cancel those on a
explicit kind of erasure, kind of exclusion and marginalization. How extreme and weird, very, very strong neurodiversity bias.
That is what bias is. It is the bias that we need to start talking about bias.
Carmen and I are probably a lot more willing than others to speak out and speak the truth. But many people are not because they don't want to be canceled.
Are you really sure how serious Jill is when she says that she's concerned about people's mental health? Jill is actually an ugly fucking hypocrite who grants allies of her organization's agenda exclusive privileges to describe themselves as having neurodevelopmental disabilities and then pursuing higher education and prestigious careers. But if an autistic person who isn't useful to the NCSA's almighty narrative gets diagnosed in that same range of disability and discusses the disabilities and difficulties that they deal with, this is how they get treated. Imagine being more upset that someone's diagnosis has the word autism in it than the fact that these people are dealing with actual, clinically significant impairments that have been recognized as legitimate characteristics of neurodevelopmental disability for over 30 fucking years, and that these people are also suffering from societal stigma against disability that's so fucking strong even today after decades of progress that they still have provably valid fears of getting fired from their fucking careers and ejected from their training programs just for being associated with what science calls the mildest manifestations of those disabilities. This being not non-severe trivial personality quirks, but the least severe end of a severe neurodevelopmental disability spectrum disorder range. A range that Jill wants to get redefined to exclude everyone except for those most like her own children.
But yeah, I mean, I think this has been one of the great debacles of autism, right? That, you know, people who are cognitively, have strong cognitive abilities, strong communication abilities, strong adaptive abilities, but have kind of social quirks, are in the same category, the same diagnostic category as my kids who are nonverbal and function like at a preschool level.
And
like,
that's a problem.
It's absurd. It's not just a problem. I mean, it's violently absurd. It's radically absurd. Is there anything in the book that could be applied instead of autism, some kind of personality disorder?
Fuck you.
Fuck you.
Fuck you.
How many doctors have you met who you would diagnose with autism?
None.
The one in, what was that, Grey's Anatomy? There was one.
Oh, the one on TV.
Yeah.
The TV doctor, right, who doesn't exist in real life.
You know what? It might be more than you think, you three. But maybe they might be hiding that fact from you, because the article you're complaining about contains proof that they're mentioning that can get them fucking fired. Fuck all three of you. Seriously, what the hell? This nonsense is so toxic that I can't account for how many brain cells my non-bigoted audience may have lost in reading and hearing this far. But I'll speak for myself. I personally can't wait to keep reading, because there's no possible way that this could make Jill and her friends look any worse. It's gonna save the rest of my brain cells being comfortable in the fact that there's no possible way that Jill or the NCSA can't possibly look any worse than they already do for their reading of only 9% of this article before complaining about how awful the article is and the falsely autistic people in it were for conspiring against truly autistic people. I can't wait to read the rest of this article to see what the rest of it has to say.
But that'll have to wait until next time.
Jill, this article that you and your friends falsely presented as a hit piece against real autistic people instead discusses how people within their least severe form of clinically recognized autism face a radically increased peril of suicidal thoughts and actions. And it also discusses the actual reproduced termination letter that was issued to an autistic doctor upon their training program directors discovering their diagnosis. And you led your bitch-ass National Council on Severe Autism and mobilizing to denounce and ridicule these innocent autistic people by only reading the first 9% of the article so you could depict them as frivolous complainers who thrived in luxury and knew nothing of the suffering of true disability. Jill, what if the autistic doctor from that article who received that termination letter lost hope that they would ever have their talents or difficulties accepted as legitimate by the non-disabled world? What if they took their own life out of fear that they would never be accepted as a doctor, and the article from Spectrum News was instead about that? Would you have still read only the first 9% of the fucking article so that you and your National Council on Severe Autism could lie about these people as being part of a hate mob of irrational disability partisan fraudsters who wanted to cancel true autistic children and silence and censor their parents? I would go so far as to say that if this Spectrum News article was titled "Doctors with Autism Speak Out Against Stigma Following Colleague Suicide," that you would have probably just refrained from reading the last 3 words of the article's name and still record a podcast that depicted the people in the article as falsely autistic activist crybabies, stealing the suffering of your truly autistic children, engaging in disability blackface, as some of your lovely online supporters like to call autistic self-advocacy. I know that that's a terrible thing to say about you, Jill Escher, but I have no fucking faith in you, and you actually are a terrible person who has no business calling themselves a disability advocate and soliciting for donations from the public for your ability to do so. Your willingness to lie about this article and to lie about autistic people other than those most like your children has no limits to its severe indecency. Because, Jill, you're a strangely terrible person who uses your autism advocacy nonprofit as an undirected weapon of mass destruction against innocent autistic people who dared to have been born with manifestations of neurodevelopmental disability that allow them to do things that your own children can't. And once again, doing all this while soliciting tax-free handouts from the public to further your ability to do so. Throughout Barrier Aggression, I've discussed misconduct from the National Council on Severe Autism that I would consider a serious wrongdoing against the disability community, including end-level autistic people, and even misconduct against some of their own unsuspecting supporters, most of whom I imagine were unaware of certain details of Jill and the NCSA's misconduct as I've discussed to this point, and might want to ask them a few questions about how extreme the positions are of a group that they thought just wanted to help autistic people with the highest levels of support needs. In part 20 of my series, however, it's going to get even worse, and I'm going to discuss acts of catastrophically demonic, crooked enormity. Acts which, to my knowledge, have gone completely undiscussed and unaddressed by even the harshest and most vocal of the NCSA's critics within the autistic self-advocacy movement. For close to 2 years at the time I'm filming this, I've sat on this knowledge, astounded that no one else has noticed or discussed this evil act from the NCSA, while I myself struggled with how to draw attention to this in a way that suitably reflected my justified anger without recklessly directing undisciplined online social justice wannabes to do reckless, dumb shit in response to this that the NCSA would love to use to justify their evil actions against autistic people who they think aren't suffering enough. Autistic people that they want the public to think are disability fakers who hate so-called truly autistic people. None of this may be a criminal matter on behalf of the NCSA, but unlike everything I've talked about up to this moment, I certainly think that what I'll discuss next time in my next video eliminates any vestige of legitimacy the NCSA could possibly retain in being trusted to influence the lives or public perception of autistic people of any description, let alone be trusted dispensing and appropriating charitably donated money from the public in order to advance their agendas. It's led me to believe the NCSA to be valid for consideration as an actual anti-autistic hate group, something I've been incredibly reluctant to say about Autism Speaks, no matter how widespread the popularity of that position is in the self-advocacy community. If I wanted quick, easy views and attention, I could have dropped the contents of what I'll be discussing in my next video back in April 2025 when I posted the first video of my barrier aggression series. Instead, I buried it 20 videos in to do everything I could to help filter out any drama-seeking social justice warrior posers looking for a zero-effort call to arms and ensure that only those with the most sincere interest and mind-numbingly detailed analysis of the National Council on Severe Autism and their hideous misconduct would be the first to hear about it. So I'll be back next time for part 20 of Weaponized Autism, and I, with all seriousness, put forward a trigger warning. I'll see you all next time. Thanks for watching.
They call her the Old Lady. She's an 040 narrow-gauge steam engine, and she works on the Tallylyn Railway in northern Wales.
With half the population dead, inexperienced civilians are recruited to man the mighty warship Whitebase.
Between Rocky Valley and Clogwyn, on the left side, is Cwm Glasbach, perhaps better known to the locals as Cwm Hetia, or in English, the Valley of the Hats. History has it that at the beginning of the railway, when carriages were more open to the elements than later on, the strong southwest